As someone who grew up along the coast of South Africa, folklore and urban legends were never something often talked about. Sure, we have our fair share of ghost stories, and even my grandfather has told us about his own encounters with the paranormal when he used to work in the warehouses down by the docks. But when it comes to creatures like Bigfoot and Skinwalkers, there are almost none I have at least heard of here. Now this happened recently. A couple days ago, actually. I've been known for my not-so-great memory, so I thought I'd write this down before I forgot. Not that I could. What I saw that night will forever be burned into my brain. I'm just about to finish school and my sister was home from university, so my family decided to take a trip to a coastal town not too far from our city. It is a lovely place, and we all share fond memories of Christmas and Easter there. We've gone so many times that the hour drive feels like minutes to me. That road had also become so familiar that it seemed impossible that anything bad could happen along it. That was until a week ago. My dad had to work, so we left quite late. It was still light enough outside, and the plan was to get there before dark, like usual. We'd done our usual routine of packing up, and had already been driving for about 20 minutes when the car suddenly shook, and it felt like we were on a dirt road, despite being on tar. My dad quickly pulled over and stopped on the side of the highway, on a stretch of long grass that was lined by trees used as a windbreak. It was not long before we discovered the back tire had burst, ripped almost entirely away from the rim. This usually wouldn't bother me as it was a quick change, but of course, things never go smoothly when you expect them to. Not only was the tire under our car, but it was locked in place to prevent someone stealing it. After years of being exposed to muddy roads and water, the lock had rusted shut so much that the key wouldn't go in. My dad finally relented and had to call someone to come help us. Another important detail was to mention my lack of shoes. Since we were only supposed to be traveling from one point to another, and both places which had relatively soft ground, I never thought to even wear sandals anymore. And since the car was up on a jack, we had to get out and stay away. As if the cold from winter wasn't enough, I was constantly stepping on thorns and in mud, my closest pair of shoes locked away in the boot. This meant I had to find the clearest patch of dirt and stand in it until I found another, forcing me to stay in one spot. By the time the tow truck arrived, the sun had set and the overcast sky was quickly getting dark. The area was surrounded by lots of farmland, meaning every now and then the haunting sound of cows calling rose up in the distance. I have slight nyctophobia, or the fear of the dark, as I often have a horror podcast or spooky stories like these playing while I work or play games. I'm the kind of person who loves horror, but is then unable to sleep for the next few nights, only to listen to more later. The guy trying to get the latch off, we'll call him Greg, went under the car and started hammering away at it from what I heard. He worked for about half an hour trying to get it off, and by then it was pitch black. My mom, dad, and sister were all a few meters away while I was stuck, trapped in my little circle next to the car. I jumped every time someone walked past or a car suddenly raced by us, though those helped ease my mind a bit. Since it was dark, you were unable to see anything out of range of the light from our vehicle, so other cars passing helped illuminate the area and tall grass around us. Now this is when things turned sour. Being as paranoid as I was, I constantly looked at the surrounding area whenever a vehicle went by, making sure there was nothing there. Of course, there wasn't for the first few times, but then something happened that sends shivers up my spine just thinking about it now. About 50 feet away, right in front of us, was a tree that stood out from the rest, in the middle of this strip of island instead of on the side. It wasn't terribly tall, but was alone with no low-hanging branches. I felt my heart stop when I looked at it, and something was looking back at me. I can only describe it as a face, but it was pale, almost white, and the eyes seemed like they had sunken at the head. It had a long, thin torso from what I could see that stood well above an average man. Its nose was elongated, like that of a buck's, yet seemed strangely human at the same time. I could just make out a thin, clawed hand gripping the trunk as it stared. I was frozen in fear when the other car passed, and that area was thrown into darkness. I kept telling myself that it was just the night playing tricks on me, that it was actually an old log that looked like a face. But when the next car came by, it was gone. That was it for me. Not even caring about the thorns anymore, I hurried across to where my family was standing, taking my place in the middle of them. But the rest of the time, I was on edge. Every twig that snapped and tree that rustled had me spinning around and staring into the darkness. More than once, I caught a glimpse of two glowing dots that would disappear as soon as I found them, and shadows would move in my peripheral vision. At random times, I'd feel my breathing become strained for no reason, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled, like we were being watched. The winch we'd been using was one of those that was assembled from multiple parts, so when my dad was done with it, I took one of the metal poles and held it like a weapon. It granted me some feeling of safety, and I didn't even care about the weird looks I was getting from my mom. Keep in mind, I hadn't told my family about any of this. My dad would have laughed and told me I was imagining things, and my sister would have just freaked out. After all, who would believe what I'd seen if they didn't see it for themselves? All I could do was wait the agonizingly long 2 hours we spent on the side of the road, clutching the bar so tightly that my fingers hurt. But I never dared to loosen them. After what felt like forever, they were finally done. And I couldn't wait another second before basically diving into the back seat. It took 10 more minutes before we actually started driving, and as we did, I looked where I'd first seen that thing. Of course, my worst suspicions were confirmed. There were no white logs anywhere around it, or branches or bushes that resembled what I'd seen. Whatever it was had been there, and then moved when it was spotted. Trying not to think about it, I jammed my earphones in, blasted music and closed my eyes, trying to sleep and forget about that. Only after we turned a corner did I realize all my muscles had been tensed and finally allowed them to relax. Like I said before, I've never heard of any urban legends that look like that thing, and the ones I have are mainly only from America. I want to look into it more, but I think part of me doesn't want to know what that creature was, whether it was some kind of African Wendigo, if that's even possible, or a ghost. I'd prefer to have some peace of mind, and I know that from now on, I'm only ever going to travel down that highway during the daytime. Let me start by saying that this story is absolutely true, but I don't remember everything in detail that happened. So at the time when this story took place was between 10 and 11 years old. I lived in the countryside, near the mountains in a country in Europe. The village I lived in was surrounded by other small villages and towns, and from the other side there were massive forests and mountains. My home was on a hill. North to my house there was my grandma's house, and he road. Then south to my house there was a forest. On east there was my neighbor home, and on the west side there was a field, and then continuation of the forest near my house. But from the west side, the forest was way bigger. At the time this story took place, it was autumn, I think so. Of course I would either go with someone or go by myself to the forest to look for mushrooms. My parents would never let me go alone, so sometimes I would lie that I'm going with someone else, and eventually they would let me, or I would sneak out. Now, I don't remember what exactly I told my parents, but they let me go to the forest that day. I remember looking for the usual path I took to the forest, but for some reason I thought to myself, why won't I take a different path today? Or something along this. Now I was in the forests looking for mushrooms, and despite me taking a different path, I knew exactly where I was. This day I decided to go a little bit further than I would usually go, but no too far so I won't get lost. If I haven't known these forests so well, I would probably be lost in the first 5 minutes after entering. It is easy to get lost there for someone who haven't been there at least 40 times before. Now I don't know how long I was there, but I think I was still looking for mushrooms when I heard something that sounded like cracking branches. I was and still am a very paranoid person, so of course I nearly shitted myself since it sounded like something heavy was walking there. At this point I turned around and started walking back the way I thought I came from. but soon I found myself lost in the forest. I did not understand how the fuck I got lost, since I haven't even got that far away. I was walking through the forest, desperate to find a path, or to see something I could recognize. But of course, I didn't. I started crying and thought that it probably was just a deer that was cracking the branches, and if not my paranoia, I would be home now or still looking for mushrooms. At this point, I was both crying and praying while walking around the forest, looking for something that will help me get the fuck out of there. Then I stopped walking and crying and praying since a feeling of relief ran over me. I didn't know why, since I was still lost in the forest, but something in my head was screaming at me to turn around. What I am about to tell is absolutely true, although it may sound extremely unrealistic. When I turned around, I saw a man in a white long dress with long white sleeves and dark hair. For some reason, I felt calm, and I felt as if I was in safety. Then he raised his hand and pointed it left to where I was standing. I felt like he is telling me to go this way. I looking at where he is pointing and then back at him, but when I turned his way, he was gone. Scared out of my mind, I started running in the direction he pointed, and sure enough, about 5 minutes later, I found the entry of the forest. When I was finally out, I realized that I was on the other side from where I originally came to the forest. I went there by the entry behind my house, but somehow I got out by the entry next to the field, which are actually really far away. And if I really walked, all this was I would have definitely noticed multiply paths that were there. I told this to my grandma, and she of course told my parents, and I wasn't allowed to go there anymore. However, when I told my grandma about the man, she looked at me and said something that maybe it was my guardian angel. And this seems to make the most sense, really. I'm a 32-year-old female. I live in a beach town in Southern California where I share a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate and her cat. Our town has beach to one side and small mountains to the other, as well as several river bottoms. We are in the middle of our town just off of a busy street, behind a seedy motel. The motel is rumored to have been a stopping point of a serial killer in the 80s, who liked to keep cut-up body parts in the bathtub. Between the motel and our apartment, there's an abandoned, chained-up lot that we refer to affectionately as Murder Lot. It has a lot of large, overgrown bushes as well as a few small trees. Many critters and even a vagabond or two could easily live there without anybody knowing. There is also a slim walkway leading from the lot and winding back between our building and the one behind us, and it passes by our bathroom window, which is too high for anybody to see into from one side or the other. It's at least 6.5 feet off the ground. I always get an extremely uneasy feeling every time I have to pass by Murder Lot, especially at night. I'm not much of a cannabis user, but I did accept a gummy from my roommate once when my body was extremely sore from a long weekend. That night, I dreamt of a skinwalker stalking me. I woke up the next day with my heart pounding, but told myself it had to have been a result of the THC in my system. I didn't dream about skinwalkers again. My roommate went out of town one night, so her cat slept in my room with me, perfectly cuddled up. We both were startled awake at around 4 a.m. to a loud beep, 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 sounding like a smoke detector. I would have sworn it was going off in my room. When I awoke, I was hot and sweaty. That, mixed with the sound that woke me up, led me to believe that our building was on fire. Again, I had just woken up and was still gaining the ability to make sense of anything. However, the smoke detector was no longer going off. It shut off on its own. I got up to see what was happening, expecting to see flames outside, to see or smell smoke. Something. When I walked into the living room and looked out the window, I saw nothing. Nothing, except a pure white cat I had never seen before. The cat was statue still, gazing directly into Murder Lot. Something about it made me freeze. I stared at that cat for a while, neither of us moving. Eventually, my roommate's cat approached me, exposing his belly at my feet. I looked down briefly to pet him, and when I looked up, the white cat was gone. I stared out the window a little while longer, waiting for the cat to return. It did not. After I determined that our building was in fact not on fire, I went back to bed. While I woke up hot and sweaty before, I now could not seem to get warm enough the rest of the night. The whole next day, I had a weird, uneasy feeling. I haven't heard any phantom smoke alarms or seen any strange cats again, but I have since noticed the fence being bent towards the ground, enough for a cat or very skinny person to crawl under. About a month later, around 8:30 p.m., I let my roommate know I would be taking a shower, in case she needed to pee before I occupied the bathroom. I did, however, leave the bathroom door unlocked, in case the cat needed to use his litter box in there. I was washing my hair when I heard a knock that I thought was coming from the bathroom door. I pulled the shower curtain back and said, "What's up?" "It's me," I heard in a strange version of my roommate's voice. I didn't think anything of it, as we often use silly voices when communicating. Thinking the cat must have needed to come in, I opened the bathroom door, expecting to see him. Nothing. I stood like that for a moment in the steamy bathroom, wondering what the hell just happened. I closed the bathroom door, and my mind and heart started racing. What the hell was that? When I came out, I asked my roommate if she had knocked, and she said no. I believed her, because she was sitting exactly as she was before I had left the room. I went to sleep that night feeling uneasy, and woke up the next day feeling horrified, realizing the knock very well could have come from the bathroom window. The next and final incident happened some weeks after that, which now was only about 2 weeks ago now. Just as I was laying down to go to sleep, I heard distressed shouting coming from an indiscernible distance from my window. "Help me! Somebody please help me!" The voice sounded not quite right. I listened for a while, and the words played on repeat until he sounded like he was right at my street corner. I looked out the window and nothing. The noise continued, and neighbors came from their houses to investigate. I called 911 to report a man in distress and waited. The neighbors went back inside, but I kept watching. After a while I saw something, cross under a street lamp in the far distance. I don't know if they were limping or not, but the movements were strange. They were too far away for me to be able to make out any features, including height. That was it for me. I decided I had done my civic duty enough for one night, turned my light out, and did my best to go to sleep while still keeping my ears open for anything strange. I haven't seen or heard anything since, but the thought of those 3 incidents caused anxiety and a pit in my stomach. I keep telling myself there's no way there's anything like a Skinwalker in my sleepy beach town. But there's a small part of me that wonders if there could be. I used to work as a kennel technician for animal control and would take Highway 202 to work every morning between 4:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. This road is regularly under construction with blocked lanes, and I liked to arrive early as my days were always packed. The night had been filled with rain, and the early morning had thick fog similar to what you'd see in Silent Hill. So I drove a bit slower and spotted a massive glowing orange sign marking the beginning of the construction. There was a humanoid silhouette walking in front of the sign, illuminated by the sign itself, and I slowed down more in case construction had started early. Still, this person had a black lacy umbrella and seemed to glide through the mist rather than walk. And as I drove closer, I noticed a feminine figure, a black dress, blonde hair, and a mourning veil obscuring her face. She didn't have legs, but rather faded into the fog. Immediately I was covered in chills and tried to rationalize why a lady in funeral attire was walking beside the highway at 5 in the morning, but I couldn't. I knew the area didn't have a funeral home or a cemetery for a fair distance, and as I was parallel to the sign, she vanished. She just walked into the sign and vanished. My heart sank, and I even backtracked to see if I just lost sight of her, but she was nowhere to be seen. I kept driving until I turned onto the road leading to the shelter and found myself in standstill traffic. I spent an hour and a half trying to go 2/3 of a mile as the fog and the flashing emergency service lights made redirecting traffic a challenge. As I reached the end of the traffic to the redirection site, I saw a motorcycle on the road, or what was left of it that had been pulled aside and was directly next to the redirecting path. A sheet was draped over a gurney that was being loaded, and even the fog didn't hide the blood soaking through the snowy fabric. A large truck was pulled off to the side, and multiple dark silhouettes were crowded around the front. I learned a few hours later that the truck and the cycle collided head-on, and the cyclist died on the scene. I couldn't help but wonder if the lady I had passed by earlier was mourning the dead, or maybe even arriving to lead his soul away. I'm used to seeing accidents in the aftermath as well as the paranormal, but it's always saddening. Even that shelter had a fair share of ghosts or shadows that always seemed to be watching. Glimpses of dogs that had recently been euthanized running between the kennels, seeing a cat out of the corner of your eye that vanished when you tried to look directly at it, and even the shadowy silhouettes of humans walking between kennels, and even crouching down where dogs were excitedly yapping at something just beyond the door. Still, I couldn't shake the events of the morning, and even when I left the campus for my apartment back across the highway, I couldn't help but glance towards the construction sign that was no longer obscured in a fog. Thankfully, I never saw her, and I still haven't seen her since. I've left that job as I couldn't dedicate enough time to the work after summer ended, and my college courses picked back up, but I still wonder if anyone who works there sees anything I saw, or if anyone has seen the woman or maybe even the ghostly figure of a man in biker's gear wandering the area. One night, driving through this same area, I spotted a little black dog in a red harness darting through traffic. Unable to leave a lost dog, especially such a small one, to the wilderness, I made a U-turn as I saw the dog dart into the grassy middle section of the road through my rear-view mirror. The dog hadn't crossed over, or appeared back on the road, which was relieving as it incredibly dark out, and chasing an animal between traffic at 50, 65 miles per hour was not ideal. I pulled over and the dog in the bright red harness was gone. Not a trace of it. There's no way I would have missed it had it darted back into the road on either side, as the harness was reflective. I spent 10 minutes dodging traffic and checking the whole area, even getting back in my car and driving around in circles, to look for that dog. I haven't seen that one since either, and I'm hoping by posting here maybe someone else would have seen the woman, the dog, or something else in that area. I have a dash cam now, though I have no idea if it will catch the paranormal, but if it does, I'll be ready next time. When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of 3, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. You know, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd, in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. Georgie and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. Georgie, 3 years my junior, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read in perfect contentment for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie just stared at me blankly. "Georgie," I said, more clearly this time, "did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." "Knocking on window?" I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought. But being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought. But what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. Kate. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still, my heart thumped in my chest. This is silly, I told myself. Be a man. I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars, Battlefront's Game Paused screen. I listened for a moment but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing, just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes. A man's shoes. None of my friends wore the size, of that I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. "No, no, no, shh," I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move. Do you understand? Do not move. I need to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones, so I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him, and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident at age 11. Forever 11. Never growing up. Frozen in time, in the memories of all who knew him, as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what, I could not hear. I stared, transfixed, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I felt. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy, beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. "No, no more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it, was trying to be quiet. I silently guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then, I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand, or maybe the hutch. "He's here!" the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky, gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the fucking toilet!" I snarled at him, the first time I had ever said that word. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once he almost slipped back down. Almost. But he was stronger than I thought he was, and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold!" screamed Georgie as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light off in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life, but that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see. Georgie had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds maybe, and finally reached the Garlands' front door. The window into their parlor was open, and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black, stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block, and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work, and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room, in the dead of night. Then, and then alone, is when the real fear sets in. In the heart of the Arizona desert lies a stretch of land where legends intertwine with reality, where shadows move with intent, and where the wind carries whispers of ancient spirits. It is here that I found myself one moonlit night, drawn by tales of a skinwalker prowling beneath the starlit sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness as I ventured into the mesquite and juniper-studded wilderness. The crunch of twigs beneath my feet echoed louder than it should have, unnerving me with each step deeper into the unknown. The saguaros stood sentinel-like, casting eerie silhouettes against the backdrop of the night. I had heard the stories from the locals, the warnings to stay away from these cursed lands after sundown. But curiosity is a potent force, and the allure of uncovering the truth behind the whispers was irresistible. As I walked, a sense of being watched washed over me. Goosebumps prickled my skin despite the warm desert air. Shadows danced at the periphery of my vision, teasing and fleeting like specters playing tricks on my mind. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the unease, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. Suddenly, a plaintive howl pierced the silence, echoing through the canyon walls. It was not the cry of a coyote nor the call of a desert owl. It was something older, something primal that sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, my heart racing as I strained to locate the source of the sound. Then from the darkness ahead emerged a figure. At first glance, it appeared human, but its movements were unnatural, fluid yet disjointed. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, reflecting the pale moon above. I froze, terror rooting me to the spot as the figure drew nearer. The Skinwalker, for that is what it must have been, wore the guise of a desert dweller, a tattered cloak of coyote pelts draped over its hunched shoulders, feathers woven into its hair, and bones adorning its wrists. Its face was a mask of ancient secrets and twisted desires, a visage that spoke of a pact with darkness. I tried to retreat, but my feet refused to obey. The Skinwalker's voice slithered into my mind, a cold whisper that spoke in tongues long forgotten. It knew my fears, my doubts, and it reveled in them. With each step closer, its presence grew stronger, suffocating me with the weight of centuries-old malevolence. Just as it reached out to touch me with fingers tipped with claws, a sudden burst of light exploded across the sky. The Skinwalker recoiled, hissing in fury as the brilliance banished the shadows around us. It was a moment of reprieve, a fleeting chance to break free from its grasp. I stumbled backwards, scrambling to regain my footing. The creature snarled, its form flickering like a mirage in the desert heat. With a final piercing glare, it vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of its unearthly howl. I fled from that cursed place, driven by primal instinct and the desperate need to escape the darkness that threatened to consume me. The whispers of the Skinwalker lingered in my mind long after I returned to the safety of civilization, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the known and the unknown, between reality and the realm of nightmares. And so, the legends endure, carried on the winds that whisper through the whispering woods of Arizona, where the spirits of the past still roam, and the Skinwalker waits for those who dare to seek the truth hidden in the shadows. It started last week. I bustled into my house with palms flat on the bottom of two very full shopping bags, each meticulously balanced against each shoulder. After putting them onto the kitchen counter, I saw it. A text notification stating that my mother had left me a voicemail. I remember the surprise I felt. My mother had died when I was 14. I am 28 now. She died of breast cancer. She died slowly. Even the doctors and nurses couldn't believe how she'd been able to hold on with such agony for so long. Obviously, I reasoned that her number had finally been assigned to someone else, and that person had accidentally called the wrong number. But when I checked, there were no calls from the number, her number, just the voicemail. I decided not to listen to it. I never listened to voicemails. Then the next day, it happened again, in the morning. I finished sorting myself out for work, suit and tie, and again a text. You missed a call from me at 7:43. Check voicemail. It was the same automated message, with no record of a call ever made when I checked my call history. So I decided to listen to the two voicemails left. Hello, Charlie? It started. The voice was static, but I could clearly tell it was my mother's voice. I almost jumped out of my skin when I first heard it, her unmistakable, croaking voice that years of chemotherapy heralded. Charlie, when are you going home? It spooked me greatly. I listened to the other. Charlie, Charlie, are you there? Are you going home? The second voicemail churned out, like metal scraping against rock. I chalked it up to voicemails that never managed to send, even though 14 years is a long time for them to finally come through. I thought it was ridiculous at the time to conceive that my long-dead mother was actually contacting me from beyond the grave. That evening I went out, saw my friend David, and got extremely, excruciatingly drunk. So drunk, in fact, that I told him what had been happening to me. I played him the voicemails. You should call her, he hiccuped out, sniffling and rubbing his beet-red nose. So I did. Of course, the person on the other end didn't pick up. The phone beeped and then went to voicemail. Leave a voicemail, he ordered, hiccuping again. I don't remember what I said. Probably some choice words and a request to leave me alone. I mean, at the time, I still didn't think it was her, my mother. The day after, I received several texts notifying me of missed calls and voicemails left. Once again, no calls, just the voicemails. I remember how my head pounded against my skull, further ushering me into fits of annoyance at the sheer gall of this stranger to continue to harass me under my mother's name. So I listened. With each one, the same garbled, grating audio persisted, albeit even harder to distinguish than before. "Charlie? Are you there? Are you going home? Charlie, don't you dare speak to me like that. I am your mother. Listen to me. Charlie. Charlie, please, don't go home, Charlie." The speech became more garbled. 236 Gospel Tree Road. "I am Mother Charlie. Knows where you are." At that last one, my body froze over, cold beads of sweat trickling down my back. The hangover didn't help my anxiety, and I ran to my bathroom to grab my medication. Lorazepam. I felt sick. What was I supposed to do? Do I call the police? I knew how the stalking laws work. Until there's an actual threat, the police can't do anything. At that point, all I knew was that whoever it was on the other line, masquerading as my mother, knew where I lived. So I did the only thing I knew to do. I called my dad. Well, my stepdad, but I called him Dad. My dad and I have a strange relationship. My mother was not a nice woman, who often berated my dad for being subpar, in her quote-unquote extremely humble opinion. She was a controlling conservative woman, who, as she grew sicker, became less and less tolerant of my dad's more erratic and free-spirited nature. Because I didn't want to be anything but the ideal son, after my older stepbrother went off the rails, cut the family off, and joined some strange self-help group, I didn't defend my dad from my mother's verbal tirades. He still thought I would take her side to this day, even though she's long gone. "Dad?" I asked after the line had picked up. He didn't respond. "It's me, Charlie. I need help." Finally, I heard a sigh, and what sounded like a scratching against his scalp. "Hi, son. What is it?" "Mother's been leaving me voicemails. Well, someone who's using her number has been. They've been harassing me, and now they know where I live. Could I stay at yours for a bit? Or maybe you come round here?" There was a pregnant pause. "I hate that you still call her that." "What?" "Mother. Like she's some icon or something. I'm Dad and she's Mother." Another pause. "But what? Someone knows where you live? Have you been talking to people online again?" I was so confused. "What? No? What are you talking about?" A deep, wry chuckle emerged from the other end of the phone. "Obviously, I'm talking about what you used to do when you were younger, Charlie. When you were on those emails with strangers online." I had no idea what he was talking about. "I never did that." "Yes, you did. That's why you weren't allowed on the computer." I became frustrated. "Okay, whatever. I'm an adult man. Why would I be emailing strangers or whatever? Someone knows where I live and I need help." Silence. "I can't help you, Charlie. It's time you learn to do things for yourself." And he hung up on me. And I was alone, in my house, with the knowledge that someone knew where I lived. Then Friday came. I was nervous, apprehensive, to come home after work. But after locking all my doors and windows, and walking around my house with a bread knife just to double-check that there was no one hiding in any possible nook or cranny, I finally felt at ease. So I cracked open a beer and sat on my sofa. Whilst watching whatever was on TV, I reminisced about my mother. She was a stern woman, but she loved me in her own strange way. I thought about how she'd never let me attend sleepovers or stay out late, how she'd made me learn the violin and piano up to grade 8 so that I'd get into a good university, how she'd only allowed herself to pick me up from school, how she'd made me spend many a night revising in front of her on the kitchen table and test me afterwards, how she'd pat me on the back for getting good grades, how she'd continually check on me throughout the night, how most of this only happened once my stepbrother finally moved out, never to contact us again. I thought some more. How frail she looked in her last few months. How she'd always look just past my shoulder, just behind me, at my dad, even as she spoke to me from her bed. How she'd berate my dad to me, tell me he wasn't a good person, and that I needed to be careful. I always thought she went a bit loopy at the end. Then ping, a text, and a voicemail. I listened. The curiosity overcame me. Just as I was about to play it, a flurry of voicemails came through. I played the first one. Charlie, you need to be careful. Lie. I was so drunk I had no idea what she meant. I played the next one. It's Mother, Charlie, Mother, knows best. Lie. It's getting harder to tell you, but you need to. He's here. There was a knock at my front door. I yelped out in fright, the shock of it all shaking me to my core. I peered out of the peephole. My dad was stood outside, looking at the ground. Before I could open the door, a ping from my phone stopped me in my tracks. Another voicemail. For some reason, everything in my gut told me to listen to it. Charlie, do not open the door. So I didn't. But I spoke to my dad through the door. Dad? Open the door, Charlie, he said sternly. I gulped. Ping, don't listen to him. What are you doing, son? Open the door? He yelled once more, pounding his fist against the door. Ping! I should have told you. Lie. I've been getting her messages too, Charlie. Let's talk, he screeched, furiously pounding at the door. Please, son. Ping. He has a knife. Charlie. I froze up. Looking through the peephole once more, I noticed he was concealing something behind his back. The sheer dread that filled my gut was something I'd never felt before. I did not like my mother, but whatever this thing was, using her name and voice, even if it was her, I knew I had to trust her. I'll call the police if you don't leave. I barely managed to utter out. He furiously kicked at the door. You've always believed her, that woman. I've been nothing but good to you, you useless. Good for nothing. And I felt it. Pure, sheer panic engulfed my body. The snarl on my dad's face brought it all back. The strangers on the computer, the emails harassing me, begging me for images of myself. How my mother berated me, how she'd smashed my computer up, even in her frail state. How she called my dad to come and look. How his face crumpled from sweet and docile into a horrendous, lecherous anger. How she'd noticed and put the pieces together, in the same way I had now. Ping. Call. The police. Charles. So I did just that. I called them. My dad never left my front door, and his screams to be let in soon turned to screams on the phone to, I assume, my mother's number, in which I heard voicemail after voicemail left by him to her. Screams of anguish that led to agonizing pleas for forgiveness, like a sinner at a confessional. The police arrived rather quickly, and after tackling my dad to the ground and forcing him into cuffs, exchanged solemn glances with one another, and came to me to offer pitied apologies. It appeared they'd recognized me, even in my now adult state, as being an individual who'd appeared on many dark web forums. Forums for unsavory purposes. Sorry, I'm not sure if I want to divulge into details, but you get the gist. Dad, though I ought to call him Stephen now, is currently in custody as I write this. I'll probably, most likely, have to be a witness in court. I've sent a Facebook message to my stepbrother, detailing everything, but I suppose he must already know, hence his lack of contact over the years. I only received one more voicemail from my mother, which came through this morning. Unlike the previous voicemails, this one was clear, untainted, almost like my mother was right here, whispering in my ear. Goodbye, Charlie. I love you. It did happen in the summer of 2008, 9 years ago from now. I was a kid back in the days, and it was a nice summer. I'm living in Europe. My parents and I love to travel a lot. That summer we traveled to the small but wonderful country Luxembourg. It's a country between Belgium in the west, Germany in the east, and France in the south. It is a country of West Europe. For the story, it's important to know that this country does have a mountainous landscape. When it did happen. So in summer 2008, my parents and I traveled in Luxembourg. We traveled with our car and 2 dogs on the roads until we decided to explore a random place. It was a clear and warm summer day. We were alone. Woods surrounded us. We parked the car on the other side of the road. For us was the small mountain of rock. It was like a wall, very smooth. It was at least as high as a house, and on top were trees. A huge crack separated the two walls like mountains. There was at the end a stairs made of rock that led up to the higher area of the place. Before we go further, I want to tell you this. I already did meet ghosts in the past. It did give me always an uneasy feeling, a creepy feeling that I'm unwanted on a place and I have to go. This time was not different, except this time a ghost did show her and she or something else played, with not much time after. When we walked in the crack, I saw her. She looked like sunshine, a strange, strong light, but this was no sunshine. She did have a bit of orange-like color and looked to us. She waved to us and smiled. My mother made a picture with her camera, and she got the ghost on that picture. I was at that time so afraid and walked right to the ghost. Stupid idea, but I just wanted to walk further. Now it sounded strange that I did not walk away from here, but right into here. When I walked in her, it felt very warm. So warm as the body heat of another person, but it surrounded when I walked in here. When I walked further, the heat was gone instantly. My mother found another path that through another crack. She wanted to explore it more, and she did. There is a graveyard here. I did not want to visit that graveyard. What I told you is 100% real.